Okay, so over the last several videos, we've been introduced to the performance style known as Commedia dell'arte, and we've talked about some of the distinguishing characteristics of those performances. We know that they were traveling performances. We know that they relied heavily on stock characters, easily recognizable to any audience they would perform in front of. We know those stock characters had distinctive costumes and personalities to help identify them to that audience. We know that the productions were largely improvised and that they had no written formal script with dialogue, but rather had what we would call scenario formats, which would just basically break down the story in the easiest possible terms so that the actors would know what needed to be accomplished in each scene and what the basic structure of the story was supposed to be. But how they got there and how they told that story was completely up to them. What I want to touch on here in this video are a few other distinguishing characteristics of Commedia performances, and also talk a little bit about what shape Commedia performances kind of have evolved into in the modern day. So let's take a look. So the first distinguishing characteristic of a Commedia performance that I want to touch on is what we call a Lotsy. Lotsy, L-A-Z-Z-I. Now, as we have already discussed, the Commedia performances were largely improv. They were made up on the spot. But the actors wouldn't go into a new scenario completely unarmed. They weren't expected to make up the entire thing just off the top of their head. They had certain bits and certain routines that were pre-memorized and pre-rehearsed that could be slipped into any scenario at virtually any point in the story. And this is where a Lotsy comes in. A Lotsy is a repeated bit of physical comedy business. So this is a physical comedy routine that the actors would practice, have it pre-rehearsed, and at any time during a production, one of the actors could give the cue line like, "Why don't you have a seat?" or something to that effect, something that would cue their fellow actors, okay, we're going to go into this specific Lotsy, and they could then perform that, put that out there, and that would take up a chunk of the time. So, a Lotsy, a repeated bit of physical comedy business, pre-rehearsed. That's important to remember. These were pre-rehearsed and pre-memorized bits. When we were taking a look at the stock characters of a Commedia performance, one of the things that I wanted you to draw your attention to were the distinctive costumes that each character would wear to immediately identify themselves to an audience. We pointed out very briefly in that video that along with the distinctive costumes, each character in a Commedia performance would wear a certain mask in order to identify them to an audience. Borrowing a little bit from the Greeks, however, these masks were not designed to cover the entire face. They would only cover the upper portion of the face, from about the forehead down to the nose. We can see here in this slide some examples of some of these masks, and as you notice, it seems like a lot of the characteristics take place in the nose. You can see Capitano's very long nose. You see Dottore has kind of a big bulbous nose. You can also see that the distinctive color schemes are still in place. There's an example of the diamond-shaped pattern of the Harlequin character. So, as we discussed in the previous video, the only characters that would not wear masks during a Commedia performance would be the characters of the young lovers. So, along with the costume and the mask, each character in a Commedia performance would also have some kind of prop that was specific to their character. When we were looking at the costume slide for Capitano, I pointed out the overly long sword, something that he could trip on or get caught up in. Another one of these props was known as the Slapstick. This was the primary prop of the Harlequin character. All right, so what we have here is an actual replica of the Slapstick that would be used by the Harlequin character in a Commedia performance. Now, as you can see, basic piece of wood with a handle. It's got a little hinge here, and that connects the top piece of wood to the bottom piece of wood. All right, so how you use it is you take and you very good. I love this thing. Sometimes the old-fashioned toys are the best, aren't they? That was a good one. So basically what Harley Quinn would use this for is taking it and aiming it towards another character's, most often Pantalone's, backside, and giving it a big... So it would generate the sound of connecting and being quite painful without actually connecting and being quite painful. So this is one of the props that Commedia actors would use in their performances. So, as we discussed in previous videos, Commedia was the most popular form of entertainment during the Italian Renaissance, and it would prove to be one of the more influential forms of entertainment. Elements of this type of storytelling and these characters would find their way into the works of artists several centuries down the road. We know that characters very reminiscent of the stock characters of Commedia showed up in things like the works of Shakespeare. The French playwright Molière was very taken with Commedia, and his work was very heavily influenced by it. You look at most of his plays, and you see some representation of the stock characters there. But as the centuries kind of progressed, as theater as we know it in a more traditional sense kind of reestablished itself, Commedia has kind of dwindled in the modern day. As I've said, its influences are still around. And there are still schools that teach exclusively Commedia training. There is a school in Italy, a very exclusive one, which has a heavy Commedia focus. So students can still learn this art form. But in terms of widespread appeal, that has waned, at least in the sense of a traditional Commedia performance. When you really think about it, there is a form of popular entertainment that is around today that borrows very, very heavily from the Commedia formula. I don't even think it realizes the Commedia influence. Any guess as to what that form of popular entertainment may be? Well, let's talk about it. So, believe it or not, the closest thing we have to a traditional Commedia dell'arte performance in the modern day would be professional wrestling. Now, I know that that sounds like a stretch, and clearly the details have changed a bit. But the core characteristics of Commedia are well represented within the traditions of professional wrestling. For example, one of the first things that we talked about in terms of Commedia's defining characteristics was that it was a traveling show. Well, in the early days and in the modern day, professional wrestling was a traveling show. Wrestling was divided up into territories, and performers would travel from one territory to the other. In the modern day, the entire production picks up and moves to a different town for each show. So, like Commedia before them, professional wrestling is heavily reliant on stock characters, characters that any new audience can easily identify. Now, clearly, the types of characters have changed. You won't find a pantalone or doctore, at least not in the traditional sense, in a professional wrestling ring. However, you will find things like the snooty millionaire, the all-American hero, the evil foreigner, the plucky underdog, the unstoppable giant, the cocky big-mouth bad guy. Just looking at this slide, even if you have never seen a professional wrestling show in your life, I can almost guarantee that just by looking at these characters and the description I just gave, you'd be able to identify who was who. Also similar to the stock characters in Commedia dell'arte, many professional wrestlers utilize the use of masks to help identify them to the audience. This is especially prevalent in cultures like Japan and Mexico, where almost all of the wrestlers are masked. Many professional wrestlers also have a signature prop or weapon specific to their character. Now, overlong swords and slapsticks have taken a back seat to sledgehammers and balsa wood guitars, but the effect is still the same. Lastly, professional wrestling is also very dependent on its use of stock storylines. Easy to follow plots that the folks can immediately get behind. The brother versus brother storyline, the betrayed friend storyline, things of that nature. Along with that, wrestlers also use something akin to the Lotsy. Remember, a pre-planned and pre-rehearsed bit of physical comedy that can be fit in anywhere during the Commedia performance. However, in the wrestling world, it's called a spot. And this is a specific bit of physical business that certain wrestlers enjoy as part of their arsenal that, again, can be fit in just about anywhere in the match. The person going to the top rope and getting caught. The giant getting tied up in the ropes. Certain wrestlers have certain move sets that they always do in all of their matches. So these spots are the modern equivalent of the Commedia Lotsy. So, just some food for thought. If you're ever confused as to the nature of Commedia and how some of these things might have looked, check out a professional wrestling match. It is the closest modern equivalent.